QSO Today, episode 512, Justin McAllister, K5EM. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. This week I want to thank contributor Neil Thompson, W9IGY, for his $25 donation, and Bill Salyers, AJ8B, for his $30 donation. A list of our regular listener sponsors is on every show notes page, and it's reported from my membership software in real time. I want to thank our donors and our regular listener sponsors for their regular contributions that keep QSO Today operating now to 512 episodes. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. I appreciate the positive feedback from listeners who write to me or make comments on the QSO Today website. It is encouraging and keeps me at it while there are other major distractions here in Israel. All of us here are walking many simultaneous paths to hold it all together. We are valuing our family, friends, and neighbors like never before, because everyone has a role to play. Justin McAllister K5EM's early interest in ham radio in high school set him on a professional path to electronic engineering for industry and startups and adoption of a few of his favorite areas of special interests. Justin likes to operate satellites with his portable full duplex rig, operate the digital modes both actively and passively, and creating new antenna designs. He likes also getting out in nature to operate POTA and SOTA. K5EM is my QSO Today. K5EM, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Justin?
Yeah, Eric 4Z1UG from K5EM. How you doing?
I'm fine, Justin. Thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
I was a teenager growing up in rural Texas, just outside of Dallas-Fort Worth, and my family would run up and down to Colorado to escape the Texas heat in August every year. My parents' anniversary was in August, and it was a good time to get out of town when it was in the hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit in Texas and go somewhere cooler. So we would go up there every summer for a week or two, and on those trips, my dad always had a CB radio in the car, and so we would listen to the CB radio, and it was a good time. We would sometimes travel with friends and use the CB to talk to friends, and so the kids were always trying to get the mic and playing the sort of trucker game and asking were there any police up ahead or whatever it might be, and so we always had fun with that as kids. And then one year, probably in the mid to late 90s, we were coming back from Colorado and just playing around with the CB radio and tuning around. And, we started hearing people that weren't close by. We started hearing DX on the CB radio. And I thought this was kind of fascinating. And my dad knew a little bit about it. He had played with CB radios for a while. And so tried to kind of explain skip to me and that sort of stuff. And I just kind of got fascinated by this. And, later that year, with some family at a gathering and talked to my uncle and learned that he actually had been a CB radio aficionado for a while and had had the amplifier and everything and had worked all this skip, and so he was telling me kind of how it worked, and I found it really fascinating and kind of tucked that away and went home and dug out one of my dad's old CB radios and put up a little mag mount antenna on a mount and tried to work DX because I thought, this is cool, I can hear these people, I must be able to talk to them, and of course it didn't work very well. My 5-watt CB radio didn't get out very well. And so I played around and kind of changed my antenna around and saw if I could do a little better. And I would make a contact every now and then, but it was mostly pretty fruitless other than hearing a lot of folks. So that kind of, faded. And around the same time, we had gotten my dad a scanner, a police fire scanner for I think for Father's Day one year, and we had the frequency table, and I'm a little more computer adept than my dad was at the time, and so I'd programmed it up with different frequencies, and one of the frequencies I put in was some of the ham frequencies for the VHF 2-meter repeaters in the area, and so we would listen to the scanner, especially during Texas storm time. So the storm, these big storms come through in the spring, and you just get lots of hail and tornadoes and wind, and we would listen to the scanner because you could hear the National Weather Service on it. You could hear the local police and fire, and as they went out to calls because of lightning or wind or whatever. And then you could also hear the ham radio operators. And so that spring of I think it was 97. We were listening to the storms come in and listening to the scanner, and we hear the Skywarn net come up. And so in the Midwest, Skywarn's an organization where hams work with the National Weather Service to spot what's going on in the field. And of course, this being the late 90s, cell phones were a pretty new thing, and people didn't have them. And so the fascinating thing for me was hearing the storm spotters talking directly to the National Weather Service forecasters over the radio. And I just thought that was the coolest thing. Here I am pretty far out in the country with this little handheld scanner with a rubber duck antenna. And I'm hearing the National Weather Service forecaster sitting in their forecast office, 70 or 80 miles away. And that was just fascinating. And so having kind of been interested in weather, my dad did a lot of storm photography and that sort of thing. I got really interested in that. And so we listened to the ham folks, and I kind of thought, well, how do I get into this? So, went into Radio Shack and talked to them a little bit about it. And they sold me a technician guide book. And so, I started getting into it. I mean, I started digging through the book, and I went really deep, really quick. And so within about a month, I was ready for my technician test. And so, got my dad to help me figure out where to go for a technician test, and tested with a local VE. And, so in 97, I think it was May of 97, I got my technician ticket. And so back then it was, novice tech plus, general, advanced, extra, I guess. And so, I got my technician ticket without any code, so I could do VHF stuff. And so that was sort of my start, but I didn't really, I didn't really know anybody. I didn't know any other hams. I didn't really know what I was doing other than, reading the book for the test.
How old were you?
At the time I was 16. So I must have just turned 16. And so I was probably my sophomore year of high school. And I was pretty active in other things, but this was really interesting to me. I really kind of, when I start getting interested in something, I tend to go really deep down the rabbit hole. And so my goal with getting the license was I really wanted to do this storm spotting thing. I thought that sounded like a lot of fun. Being 16, I had just gotten my driver's license. I just rebuilt a Chevy pickup. That was my first car to drive around in. Living out in the country, having a car was sort of, everything as far as freedom went. And so I thought, I'm going to go get into this Skywarn thing. And so I signed up for a Skywarn class at the HamCom hand convention, which back in the late 90s, HamCom was quite a huge ham convention. Not quite Dayton, but I think the numbers were close to 10,000 back in the heyday of HamCom. And so went there, got myself got Skywarn certified. And I guess before that, I needed a radio. And so the story of how I got my first radio was kind of fun. I again, not knowing anybody, sort of early days of the internet, didn't really know even, who to call. So I thought, well, I could go to Radio Shack and buy whatever, VHF handheld or mobile they had. But having just gotten a vehicle, I was convinced that I needed a mobile. And I wanted to be storm spotting. So of course I had to have a mobile radio. So, my solution to this problem was I took that same scanner and I climbed up on my parents' roof, and I programmed in, somebody had told me, or had heard maybe, some folks just talking, on the radio, that there was a net at a certain time, that did, buy, sell, trade of ham gear. So I climbed up on the roof at the right time. I had to stand up on my parents' chimney with a, handheld held high with a notepad, listening to folks list off different things. And of course, most of the time I had no idea what they were talking about. But I heard somebody advertise a VHF mobile radio. I thought that's the one I want. And, the price was in my price range. So wrote down the phone number on the notepad and went downstairs and called the guy and arranged pickup. So my dad took me over and we picked up the radio. He showed us his ham shack. He had a big tower and a big HF station. So that was pretty neat to get to see. It was probably my first time seeing an HF station. So that was neat, but it was abstract at the time. And it was, I was really ready to do this storm chasing thing. So I got that radio and, I was off to the races. But I started looking for a club. I was like, well, I need to find some other people. I went to the local club that was kind of closest to me. And, I think like a lot of club experiences for new hams, it was a lot of, older folks that were really kind and, very welcoming, but didn't really have anything in common with anybody there. And they were interested in, HF and DXing and all this other stuff. And I was interested in, storm chasing. That was going to be the thing. So I went around to a few other clubs. I think I got my dad to drive me up to a club meeting, a bit farther away of a different club. And when I walked in the door, immediately somebody close to my age walked up and started, introduced themselves and kind of started bantering with me. And it ended up being a guy that had a brother and a sister, and his family were all ham. So there were 5 of them in the family, 3 kids and the parents. And so his younger brother, it turns out, was exactly my age. And so we met and hit it off. We're still great friends to this day. And started, doing the ham thing together. So started talking on the repeater. We would drive to school each morning with our VHF radios in our trucks. And, that was our commute. I had a certain point in my way to school where I could get over a hill and finally hit the repeater that he could hit, because we lived probably 55 or 60 miles apart. And so that was a really good time, talking to new friends every morning on the drive to school. And that sort of kicked off, that ham process for me and was really the first folks that was like, oh, okay, these folks are, my age and interested in similar things as me. This is a lot of fun.
Did you share the Skywarn chasing with this new friend, or did you end up going someplace else?
Yeah, that's a good question. We didn't end up chasing a lot together because we lived so far apart. From time to time, I ended up in his neighborhood, so to speak, when I was doing Skywarn spotting. The way Skywarn's set up in that part of Texas, at least, it's sort of county by county. And so he lived in a different county than I did. And in our county, I was sort of part of the Skywarn organization. And as you get into the larger Metroplex area, Dallas-Fort Worth, it was all done under RACES and ARES. And so it was a lot more, I guess, formal than it was where I grew up. So you had to be a member of their ARES and go through their specific training and that sort of thing. And so I did some kind of peripheral of Dallas-Fort Worth spotting. And then, over time, as I got into college, I actually did some actual storm chasing where I'd drive up to Kansas, Nebraska, and actually seek out the tornadoes.
Who or what was K5UTD, and how did that play an impact on you in your high school years?
So this friend, his name was Bo, KC5ZWO. Him and his family were into HF and into radio a little more. And so he introduced me to, or he invited me to Field Day. And we went to Field Day with him and was able to sit down and work a bunch of stations during Field Day when I was in high school still. And so the two of us started talking. We became good friends. We took the SATs together. And when we were both looking for colleges, UTD came up as one of the options. So we went over, a friend of mine and I went over, a different friend, and did sort of the orientation, or I guess this is like sort of pre-orientation. It was kind of the marketing night for the college. So you would go over and you'd spend the night with some college students in a dorm, get used to the campus and just look around and understand how the campus worked. They'd talk to you about all the different programs and that sort of thing. But of course, the thing that caught my eye was on the engineering building, there was a massive tower with a big beam on top. And I said, that's got to be ham radio. And so during some of the free time, I started exploring around and found the ham station in the engineering building at the University of Texas at Dallas, which is the K5UTD. So that became a big draw. in the idea of potentially going there for school. I hadn't actually picked which school I was going to go to yet, but I realized this school had a nice ham station, and that was something I hadn't seen anywhere else. So I ultimately ended up looking at a few other colleges and decided on UTD. And so as soon as I got there as a freshman, I got there a couple weeks before school started and got into my dorm and everything, and immediately went straight to the ham shack. And I was there early. There wasn't really a lot of people around yet. There was a sign on the door that said, for access, call this number or whatever. And so I found a phone and called that number, and was introduced ultimately to the administrative assistant for the dean of the engineering school. So the dean of the engineering school at the time was Dr. Bill Osborne, K5ZQ, I believe. So met him before school started, and he showed me the station and showed some of my friends, Bo and another gentleman, Justin, showed us all the station and sort of introduced us to the ham shack that existed as K5UTD. And that was really, sort of a pivotal moment in my college, because that ham shack ended up being the place I spent all my free time for the next 4 years.
It appears to me that you graduated with a BSCE from UTD. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Was that interest in becoming an electronic engineer spurred from the amateur radio interest, or was that something that you had planned to do anyway?
It actually had a lot to do with ham radio. Originally, my mom worked for General Dynamics, which later on was Lockheed Martin, and so I was sort of around the aircraft industry as a kid. We went to air shows, we went to open houses at the factory there in Fort Worth, and so I was always interested in aviation at some level. And so my sort of plan as I got older, I knew I wanted to be an engineer of some kind. And I had this idea that I was going to be a pilot. I wanted to be a test pilot and an aerospace engineer. So I wanted to design planes and fly them. That was my dream, I guess, as a burgeoning high school student. And then at some point, I don't remember if it was a guidance counselor or somebody else said, that's not really how it works. You don't design the airplanes and fly them. You can design the airplanes or you can fly the airplanes, but these days you don't really do both. And that was a huge moment of disappointment for me. And I said, well, okay, if I can't do that, designing airplanes that I don't get to fly doesn't actually sound like a lot of fun. And I was getting into ham radio. And I started building electronics kits. I really enjoyed that. Enjoyed soldering. Didn't have any clue what I was doing at the time, trying to learn all this stuff on my own without a lot of outside help. And, but it was a lot of fun. So when I was a senior in high school, I actually built up a NorCal 40A as my first radio kit. That was a really interesting process. And the folks from Wilderness Radio were great. They, I had problems, and I sent them an email and asked them, I have these problems. Can you help me try to solve it? And hours later, I get a phone call. The phone rings in the house, and my mom says, Justin, it's for you. It's some guy in California. Sure enough, he'd called me and, sat on the phone with me for half an hour, walking me through different testing. And so that was really interesting to me, and trying to understand kind of how these circuits worked and what they did. And so I decided, kind of through that process that electrical engineering sounded really interesting. I wanted to learn a lot more about this, and wanted to learn how to design my own circuits and my own radios. And so ultimately that led to, as I started looking for colleges, electrical engineering being the path I was most interested in.
Did you build that NorCal 40 using the textbook that was designed to go with it?
I did not. I learned of that textbook probably 3 or 4 years later when I was in college, and actually took it to the dean and said, Dr. Osborne said, hey, we should really start a class around this. This would be cool. It never came to fruition, but I actually didn't have access to that textbook. I think had I at the time, it would have been a really even better learning experience. But I was very green on even just soldering. So putting this kit together was sort of a big step for me, and finally getting it to work and getting the radio on the air was just felt like a huge accomplishment as someone who had, I'd built a few little Ramsey kits and that kind of thing, but this was much more complex, and to be able to actually use it to make contacts was just the coolest thing.
So you spent all of this time at K5UTD at the ham radio station. One of the things that you pointed out, you began to experiment with antennas, partially as part of the maintenance there and partially as a result of an interest in antennas. Is that how an interest in antennas developed for you?
Yeah, so I think when I was in high school still, I got interested in antennas. Being as far sort of out in the country as I was, just a little vertical antenna or something didn't really work for VHF, and so I had this VHF radio that I bought. It would go from my truck to my shack and back to my truck every day. I built a little slide mount for it so I could quickly slide it out, take it inside. And so today, like you'd carry your cell phone, out of the car and into the house. I carried my, mobile rig in and out of the house. And at first I did have just a little vertical antenna at the house, a little, quarter wave vertical that I'd made according to the ARRL antenna book. And it didn't work very well. So I started looking for other options. I built with the ARRL, I said the antenna book, just the normal ARRL manual, I built a Yagi, and I didn't have any real good way to tune it. The radio didn't have a SWR meter on it, and I didn't have an SWR bridge. And so, I kind of did my best and cut it to spec and then threw it up there and kind of hoped it worked. And it actually helped a little bit. I was able to connect to repeaters that I hadn't been able to connect to from the house before. And so that was helpful, but it wasn't quite enough. I knew I needed more. About the same time in high school, there was, 10 meters was really burgeoning. I'd gone to field day. I went to a couple different field days and just got really interested in the whole field day process, both building the whole stations and how everything worked, as well as operating. I really enjoyed the kind of radio sport aspect of field day at the time. And so I kind of wanted to do that, for myself at my house. And so sort of a few things came together at the same time. I told my dad was in construction as I grew up. So we had all kinds of extra construction materials, and I grew up with a pretty big workshop out in the country, and we had land and that sort of thing. So I wanted to build a tower, and I knew I couldn't afford to buy a tower. And so I also at the time was really into soccer. I was a pretty active soccer player my whole childhood and into high school before an injury knocked me out before college. But I started with wanting to build a soccer goal. And I told my dad, I want to build a soccer goal. Will you build me a soccer goal? He said, well, no, I'm not going to build you a soccer goal. But you can build your own soccer goal. He said, we got everything you need to do it. And I said, well, I don't know how to weld. And so that was, so he taught me to weld. And one evening, he taught me to weld. He went off to work the next day. This is in the summer, probably, I don't know, after my junior year of high school. He went off to work one day, having taught me to weld the day before. He came back home that evening, and I had about 2/3 of a soccer goal built in the driveway, blocking his parking spot. And so, he had to help me finish it up and kind of go a little further. And I said, okay, now that I know how to do this, now that I know how to weld, I want to build a tower. So he kind of helped me plan out a tower that I could build. And, it was quite the process. Poured the concrete foundation. We set a pipe in the concrete foundation to set the tower over. We had some water pipe that he had gotten from a job. I think there were 15-foot lengths of water pipe. So we got a pair of those, kind of put them together, and then put angle iron around the sides where the joint was, so could extend the two together. I had picked up a TV antenna rotator from a yard sale at some point. And then the antenna that was going to go on top actually came from an interesting story. The gentleman that lived behind our property across the street, my dad was up talking to him one day, and he said, hey, they were talking, and somehow it came up that I was interested in ham radio. And he had been a CB, a long distance CBer. And so he tells my dad, well, just send your son up. I have an antenna I want to give him. So my dad sends me up there. So I walk up to the back 40 and jump the fence and knock on his door. And I said, hey, my dad sent me up here for an antenna. And he said, yeah, okay, let me show you where it is. I've got an antenna for you. So he takes me out to the front yard, and he points up in a tree. And he says, if you see up there, there's a 5-element Yagi for 11 meters. It's fallen into the tree. It fell off my tower in a storm. It looks like it's still in pretty decent shape, but it's in the top of the tree. If you can get it down, you can have it. So, so I go back home and, enlist my dad's help, and we get a ladder in the trailer, and we bring it all up, and, I climb up into the tree, and I start taking apart this Yagi and sending the pieces down to my dad. So some of the aluminum was bent, but the mast, the boom was good. Most of the pieces were actually in pretty good shape, and I managed to get most of the pieces down without destroying it completely. Got it down to the house, kind of laid everything out to see what he had, and figured out, okay, I've got enough aluminum to build a 4-element Yagi out of this per the AWRL handbook. And so we took the boom, re-drilled the boom, put all the elements together per the specs, had a gamma match on it, and that was the antenna that was going to go on this tower. So the tower was sort of built around that antenna plus a 2 meter, the 2 meter Yagi I had was going to go on top. So we built the tower. Dad was kind enough to rent borrow a cherry picker from a friend of his, and we were able to pick up the whole tower with a cherry picker, put it down, guy it off. I'd welded steps all the way up it so you could climb up and down it. I was also a bit into rock climbing at the time, so I had all the rock climbing gear and harness and everything. So tried to be as as safe as a 17-year-old kid can be climbing up and down a homemade tower. And so we got that antenna up and immediately started working DX on 10 meters. It was really a lot of fun. This was right at the peak of the sunspot cycle. So that was sort of, the introduction, I'd say, into antennas. I didn't design it at that point, didn't even simulate it, but, it was really fascinating to me that you could cut this metal to spec, and out came an antenna that, worked and had directionality and a little bit of gain. And this process was really fascinating to me. And so I, throughout the rest of high school, built a few other antennas. I built a 7-element cubical quad for 2 meters to improve my 2 meter reception, which worked really well once it was up on the at 35 feet on the tower. That was a really big improvement in being able to work different repeaters. And there would be nights in Texas where you get tropospheric ducting, and we would be working on one repeater frequency and all of a sudden hear a different repeater and spin the quad around, and all of a sudden we're talking to people in Houston through a Houston repeater, which is a few hundred miles away. So it was a really fun time. Just a lot of different things as a 17-year-old kid, really into it, trying lots of different stuff, building lots of different stuff. It was really fun. We had a good time.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player, link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. You took a hiatus there once you graduated from college, didn't you? You ended up doing what many of us do, and that is you start a new career, you start a family, and amateur radio kind of gets put off to the side. What happened during those years? What did you end up doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I did a lot of work. Worked long days. Got really into my career, building drones. I started as an avionics engineer. Pretty much fresh out of college, building autopilots and inertial navigation systems for drones, and then worked my way up and over the course of about 10 years to being a chief engineer on big programs. And so, it was just that process of growing. Took some graduate classes and that kind of stuff, and just did not have time for ham radio, and I didn't have the place for the ham radio. I'd come from being on this, land out in the country in Texas to then being at K5UTD and having this just incredible station, operating in a lot of different contests. I guess that story wouldn't be complete without mentioning my friend Ollie, DK1CM, who came over to UTD as an exchange student and really got me into contesting. Ollie became a good friend, and we took him out to the farm in Texas and got to show him the longhorn cattle, and he taught us how to contest. So that was a great time. Did a lot of contest operating. Had this great station, but when I moved to California for work, I was in a tiny 500 square foot apartment in Pasadena and didn't really have access to much of a station. Visited the Caltech station a couple times down the road, but as a non-affiliated person, really, that wasn't that easy to find time to operate. I'd have to bug somebody else to let me operate. And, work got really busy, and just kind of the ham radio faded into the background.
So you did your graduate work at Caltech?
No, I didn't. I was near Caltech. Yeah. My wife was going to seminary in Pasadena. So that's where we lived when I moved to California. At first, I actually worked out in Ventura County, which was about a 45 minutes hour commute, 3 hours on a bad LA traffic day. And so when she finished grad school there in Pasadena, we moved out to Ventura County, and moved from a tiny apartment to a relatively tiny condo, and just didn't really have any access to a station or antennas or any of that kind of stuff.
You were commuting into the valley?
Yeah, I was commuting from Pasadena to out to Simi Valley. So Simi Valley is where I worked and lived for about 8 years there.
What was the magnet that kind of brought you back into ham radio?
After being inactive in California for quite a while, I tried, towards the end of my tenure at AeroVironment, right before I started my own company, I was kind of getting interested in radio again, but I was really just too busy, spending, working long hours. When I left there and I started my own company, starting your own company is super busy too, but I kind of forced myself to add a little more time for stuff I wanted to do, because at the time I was pretty burned out, and starting a new company is difficult and stressful in and of itself, and so I knew I needed to kind of be able to do other things for myself at the time, and so I started looking into radio a little more. I visited some field day sites, a couple different clubs. Didn't really find any groups that I really clicked with. I think this is one of the challenging things I've seen in radio, is field days kind of set up as an opportunity for new folks to come into the hobby. But I found, at least in my experience, that even as an active, experienced ham visiting field days, I didn't get a lot of reception. It was a difficult time to try to connect with folks, and I get it. I've done field days enough to know that folks are busy and they're trying to keep stations running on the air and that sort of thing. But it wasn't I didn't feel very welcome in any of the field day sites I went to. Not that I felt unwelcome, just that, it wasn't an opportunity to really connect with anybody. And so that was sort of in the back of my mind. Started a new company, got really busy with that. And with the new company, the three co-founders, we were all sort of transplants into Southern California. None of us had roots there, and none of us really had a strong interest in staying there long term. So we looked at different places to move the company before we grew it too much. And Seattle popped out as sort of the place everybody was was amicable to. So we moved up to Seattle in 2015, I guess, early 2015. When I moved up here, I moved into a house, and all of a sudden I had a little bit of space again. It's kind of the first time since I was in college that I had even the prospect of enough space to do radio. I also, around that time, started looking around for clubs. One of the things I'd learned when I was in Texas, I had been invited, because we did some radio sport at UTD, met folks at Hamcom. Been invited to the North Texas DX Society's banquet at Hamcom. That was really neat to see, kind of first time experiencing folks that had been on DXpeditions and that kind of thing. So that was really cool. I guess that during that process, I learned that having become an electrical engineer, being interested in antennas and contesting and those aspects of the hobby, that I was really attracted to kind of the more technical piece of it. The DX clubs really, scratched that itch for me. And so when I moved up here to Seattle, pretty quickly, I attended a Western Washington DX club meeting. And it's the same kind of thing as in Texas. I found a like-minded group of folks that were really interested in both DX and contesting, and I think more than anything, the technical aspects of the hobby. How do you build antennas? How do you keep stations quiet? And that kind of thing really, really interested me.
And it seems to me that as a result of living on the city lot, perhaps you can speak to this, but you actually were lucky enough to have an article in Hackaday magazine, which is an online site and a magazine. You made a video presentation called Simple Antennas Suitable for a Zombie Apocalypse. I think most of us these days who live on small lots are probably thinking that that's quite an apropos title for a desperate need for an antenna, but trying to figure out how to make that work. Did you apply what you present there in that presentation to what you did on your own property?
Yeah, I think I did as much as I could. Over the course of being at UTD and having access to, we had a huge tower on a roof of a building we had pretty much unfettered access to, which these days is difficult to get. I got to try a lot of different things. I got to put up some wire antennas, some receiving antennas, a couple of different beam antennas, and kind of see, at least in that environment, what worked and what didn't. When I moved here to Seattle and wanted to put up a station at home, I knew that I didn't have a lot of options. I live on a small city lot. There's some restrictions on what type of stuff I can put up. So I knew that, wire antennas that were going to be difficult, kind of difficult to see and a little stealthy was sort of the way to go. So in my lot here, the configuration I ultimately went with was an in-fed half wave, and that was an antenna that I wasn't super familiar with before I implemented it. And a lot of folks told me, especially the folks from the DX Club, that have 200-foot towers with big Yagis on them, said, it's going to be a noisy antenna, it's never going to work. But I think the combination for me of the antenna that worked for my space, the fact that the FT8 was really becoming popular kind of around that same time, really that combination enabled me to set up a station that actually worked for my needs. So I bought a new radio. At the time I didn't have any radios. I started with an ON 10E. I was interested kind of in the SDR space, and so got that all working, and only 10 watts out, but I was working folks across the US and even some DX from a very modest, in-fed half wave tied up, one end on my chimney and the other end on a tree. And so that was pretty helpful to get me continue that interest and really burgeon the idea that, okay, you can make some contacts here. You can do it without really a whole lot of, big towers or too much money invested in the process. And I think that was a lot of fun. When I did the Hackaday talk, my goal in that talk was to introduce a lot of topics that folks could, do more research on their own. I find that when I get interested in something, a lot of times it's difficult to ultimately decide where to put your effort in searching for information. You know that this topic's interesting, but you may not even know the right search terms to search. And so what I did with that talk was, apologies. I thought my phone was on vibrate, but it's not. So what I did with that talk at Hackaday was I wanted to introduce a lot of antenna topics that I had learned over the years with my different experimentation and research. I wanted to introduce the topics to a level, not where somebody could necessarily go design their own antenna, but so that they knew the terminology to use. They knew the different types of antennas, the different, understanding what does it mean for picking a coax impedance. Why would you pick this impedance of coax over that impedance of coax? And so I wanted to really provide an introduction to antennas and show people that antennas are, while they can certainly be black magic, there's a lot of basic antenna types out there that really anybody can build without a ton of in-depth knowledge. There's a lot of tools online if you kind of know what to search for and how to search for them. And so that was really my goal in that talk, was to help folks get introduced and hopefully take the next step and build their own antenna.
One of the things I noticed before we talk about the background in the room that you're sitting in, you like to operate satellites and take satellites on vacation with you. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I always had sort of in the back of my mind an interest in satellites. It started, back when I was in high school. I mentioned the cubicle quad antenna that I'd built. One of the things that I got into during that time, my Elmer, who I didn't really mention up to now, but KJ5ZR, he lent me a KPC3 at one point, Cantronics TNC, and I got into doing a little bit of digital, ham stuff. So, late 90s, early internet times. And it was fun to get into, be able to connect to a BBS and share messages with folks and that kind of thing. It's kind of walking in parallel with kind of my introduction to the internet as a teenager at the time. But one of the things that really, really sparked my interest in that was there was a BBS on the Mir space station. And that was fascinating to me. And I had tried a few times with the Yagi antenna that I'd built. I think it was like a 4 or 5 element Yagi to connect to the Mir, and I could just barely hear it, but it wasn't well enough to connect. When I built the cubicle quad antenna, I was looking for better range in VHF in general. But one of the things that I thought was, well, I wonder if I'll be able to connect to Mir with this. And ultimately, I was able to, and it was just a really exciting, thing to be able to connect to this computer on this, orbiting space station as a 17-year-old kid. It was just, it's kind of mind blowing that I could do this. And so that was really cool. And so I had that introduction, but I didn't really, after that period, ever really have access to equipment that would let me do any satellite work. Fast forward to living here in Seattle. I had purchased years before a THD7, APRS TNC. I was kind of into APRS in college, and APRS handheld radio. So it had the TNC built in. But at the time, for whatever reason, I never really realized that it was full duplex. When I moved here to Seattle, I was active on Twitter, and I kind of noticed that there was a lot of AMSAT chatter on Twitter, and thought, oh, this will be fun I'll just try to listen with a handheld. And in the process, realized, I actually have a full duplex handheld already. So went into the garage one night and built an antenna to a spec that a gentleman in England, M1GEO, had. He sort of optimized someone else's antenna, and it's a 2 meter Moxon 440 Yagi. So this combination of these two antennas, but what's neat about it is it's only got one feed. So you feed the 2 meter Moxon directly with your coax, and it parasitically drives the 440 antenna. And so it's really neat for someone like me who had a full duplex handheld without a diplexer or anything, to be able to just hook this up and it works. So that's what I did. I think that night I built this antenna. I took a piece of wooden strip board that was in my garage. I drilled some holes through it, stripped some, house wiring, 12 gauge house wiring, used that as the antenna elements, built up this really crude antenna, took it outside, and first pass of SO50, I'm hearing the satellite. And I thought, okay, this is really cool. Now I'm hearing an overhead satellite, and struggled a little bit with trying to get into the satellite myself. Posted some messages on Twitter. Hey, I can hear SO50, but I can't seem to get into it. Sometimes I can get into it later in the pass, but I can't early in the pass. And somebody responded immediately, well, did you turn it on? I said, well, yeah, of course my radio's on. What do you mean? No, did you turn the satellite on? And I had no conception at the time that SO50 has a timer. It comes on for 10 minutes, and then after 10 minutes of inactivity, or after a few minutes of inactivity, it goes back off. And so you have to transmit a PL tone different than the normal access PL tone in order to trip the timer and turn the satellite on. And living here on the west coast of the U.S., most of the passes I was trying, the satellite was coming in off the Pacific Ocean, and literally no one had turned it on. So that was a fascinating thing to learn. And of course, the next pass I run outside and I'm able to turn on the satellite, and it was really nice because living here in the West Coast, we get a lot of passes that are just out over the Pacific. They're not very active. You go, my time to play with radio was usually late in the evenings, 10 p.m. or even later. And so I'm out just, outside my house in the street trying to, basically standing out there like a crazy person talking to myself through this satellite. And there's nobody else on the satellite, but it was great because I really learned quickly how to get my signal into the satellite, how to play with the polarization and the pointing. And that was actually a really nice introduction to satellites that would be difficult to get, I think, if you lived in the middle of the U.S. or maybe closer to Europe, where satellites are always active and there's always somebody on them. It was really nice to kind of have the satellite to myself to be able to really quickly iterate and learn through to how to do that operation.
Plus, you're operating duplex, so you had that instant feedback, even though you had nobody talking to you, of how you were getting in and out.
Yeah, exactly. I think, anybody that really wants to operate satellites with any seriousness, I think full duplex is really the way to go. It's definitely how to do it. I bought a FT817, used it at Hamfest, and started using the combination of the handheld and the 817 for different satellites. I went down in, I believe it was 2018 to Oregon to see the total solar eclipse. And when I was going down to Oregon for the total eclipse, I realized, I'm going to a grid square that's really wanted. In the grid maps of the time, I think it's DMO4 or DNO4. It was one of the most wanted grids. And so I thought, I'm going down to this grid, I might as well take the satellite gear with me and try to operate from there. So I ended up activating quite a few passes, half duplex with the single 817, while also operating HF from my campsite, and had a ton of fun. Had no cell service, so I really didn't have any feedback other than talking to people through the radio of what was working and what wasn't. And it was a struggle for me and a struggle for everybody, but I learned a lot. I learned, I think, more than anything, that I needed full duplex to be able to do this effectively, and ultimately ended up getting a second 817. And so anytime I would travel, whether it was family vacation or for work, I'd try to take my gear with me.
The FT817 doesn't work duplex?
No, a single radio doesn't. And so the sort of common thing to do in the satellite community is what we call the FT1634, where you take a pair of 817s and bolt them together and use one radio for transmit and one for receive. And so then you can do all modes, on one setup, and it's relatively lightweight. You can hang it around your neck or put it in a pouch of some kind and be able to control that while you're roving.
What's SatMatch?
So SatMatch was a website that came out of a personal need of mine. I was planning a trip out to Hawaii for a family vacation, and thought, I'm going to take my satellite gear with me. I kind of announced this on Twitter, and to my surprise, a bunch of people immediately started responding, I really need Hawaii for worked all states. Can you work me? And so I thought, okay, I'll try, but how do I even start with this? So I started looking at different satellite software out there, and at least the software that I had looked at and downloaded at the time, it was basically just, scroll the slider through the orbits and look for orbits that kind of match the areas that you want to see, just looking at the footprint on a map. And that was pretty crude. So I thought, I can probably write some software to do this pretty easily. And so over a weekend, I put together some Python scripts to predict orbits for 2 locations, and then look for times when those orbits overlapped. And that ultimately turned into SatMatch, which I published a week or two before I went to Hawaii, and it let me search and publish a schedule of the passes that I was going to be on, in order to really optimize the times that I was going to be on the air. Because of course I'm on vacation. My family doesn't want me running back and forth to the coast to do passes all the time. And I don't want to be on passes where it's just, me in the Pacific Ocean. So, SatMatch was a tool I built for myself. And then it kind of evolved over time into an all-purpose tool for satellite rovers, kind of for the same purpose. And so I wanted it to be a site where people could easily do a search, find an overlap, and then copy that link and send it to a friend, and they could just open the same link and see the same pass and have all the same information about what they were doing. It's still up today. It's still used quite a bit. I think a lot of different rovers use it. I think one of the pieces of it that the things that came out of SatMatch that I never really expected was there's rovers that in the satellite community. In the satellite community, there's rovers that really want to maximize distance. So there's quite a few distance records for different satellites. If you go onto one of the AMSAT pages, it actually has the distance record for each satellite individually in different modes, I think even. And some rovers, some of them here in my area that I know, started using SatMatch to plan passes with folks that were right at the fringes of what you could do with the satellite, trying to set distance records. And they emailed me and said, "Hey, I'm using SatMatch for this. Can you add these features?" And so one of the features I added to SatMatch that was sort of new at the time, I guess, was the ability to search for passes below your own horizon. Because folks were going up to mountaintops, whether that was, the Kilauea volcano in Hawaii or, one of the big volcanoes around here or just, a big mountain on the coast. They were going up to these mountaintops and they were working passes that, didn't show up in other pass matching software because it was below the horizon. So SatMatch lets you really tune the parameters of what you want to search for. And so you can put in negative horizons. You can change your altitude above sea level to really fine tune to get the passes you really want. And so folks have now used SatMatch to set, I think, almost every satellite record that's been broken over the last few years. And some of these passes are, 2 degrees below the horizon on both ends, taken into account, not just elevation and below horizon passes, but also, refraction to really eke out that last few tens of kilometers to break those records, which has really been kind of cool to watch.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO.
Justin, you have a Hermes 2 software-defined radio transceiver. How are you using it, and what do you use it for?
Yeah, so I have 2 of them. The Hermes Lite 2, which are I think it was a crowdfunded project that you can purchase. So I have a couple of them, and I actually have them set up not as transceivers but as skimmers. So they're one of the neat things about that radio is it's an all open source project, and some folks have made open source firmware for it that instead of having transmitters and receivers within the FPGA fabric. Instead, they have just 10 receivers. And so it will listen simultaneously on all 10 HF ham bands for, I think it's 192 kilohertz of spectrum you get on each band. And then that is all connected to a computer, which runs either the Spark SDR software, which is an open, not an open source. It's a closed source software, but that is designed originally to work with the Hermes. The other radio runs the CW Skimmer software suite, which also includes the WSL Digi or CSL Digi, whatever it's called, that does the skimming. So I have those set up. Each of them is connected to a different antenna. One of them to the end fed, and one of them is hooked up to the Delta loop. And so those just sit all day when I'm not using the radio. and listen to both CW and all the different FT8 frequencies, both the standard FT8 frequencies, the FT4 frequencies, and then I've also got programmed in some channels for what are normally the DXpedition frequencies. So they just sit there and listen all day, and they report to PSK Reporter. And that was a fun process to get all that working and up and try to see how many spots a day I could get. I've got some local noise living here in the city. Sometimes it comes and goes. On a really good day, I've produced about 55 or 60,000 spots to PSK Reporter, which that's how many actually get uploaded. The number of actually received FT8 or CW is in the order of 250,000 up to 500,000 even in a day. So it's been a lot of fun. It helps me to watch propagation, and I use it quite a bit to understand where the bands are open to for my station, and try to work new DX with that.
And you also get to see how your antennas are performing, at least on the receive side, so you know if they're directional and which directions they favor.
Yeah, exactly. It's very useful for that, and it's been enlightening. The delta loop antenna for 15 meters. It's a tuned 15 meter delta loop. It's resonant, but it actually hears DX on 80 meters quite a bit better than my in-fed half wave does. So that was a pleasant surprise. The in-fed does not get out on 80 meters very well. It's not very high. I think it's only about 20 feet up. And so that's, I don't really work 80 meters that much, but it's been interesting to be able to see that those reception reports come in on the Delta loop and pick up stations that I couldn't hear before when I just had the in-fed as a skimmer.
We're talking right now on Google Meet, so I'm looking at your video. You're sitting in your workshop, and I see to your right is your ham radio workbench, or maybe it's your general, when you feel like building anything, workbench. What's the most interesting piece of equipment that's sitting on your workbench right now?
Oh boy. So this is my workbench, a combination of ham radio fun, but it's actually my professional job. So I'm a electrical engineering consultant. I build products for different companies. And actually what's kind of sitting over there right now is one of my clients' pieces of hardware. So I can't tell you too much about that. But as far as interesting goes, I think my interesting is probably boring to others. I had the really nice privilege of being able, when I worked in the defense industry in Southern California, I worked with a lot of really skilled solder techs. And when I was in college, I worked as a solder tech for about a year, but I never had any formal training. I worked for a small company, a guy that was really a consultant. He brought in college students to, help him build stuff, but he taught me how to solder, but not in a really certifiable kind of way. When I worked in the defense industry, though, there's lots of different regulations you have to follow and that kind of thing. And so I went through, I get to go through a full solder tech course. It was one of the things that our electrical engineering manager wanted all of the electrical engineers to do, mainly as a tool for an electrical design engineer to understand, hey, somebody's going to be building this. How do you actually, build things that are manufacturable? What are the problems you're going to run into? And so through that process, I got exposed to good professional soldering equipment, microscopes and that kind of thing. And so to me, actually, the most interesting piece of equipment I've got over there is this microscope you can see. And it's not a very expensive one as far as microscopes go. You can pick them up these days on AliExpress for, a few $100. But a nice stereo microscope is a superpower. Whether you're soldering wires together or you're soldering, 0201 surface mount components, or you're trying to get a splinter out of your kid's foot, it is the best tool, I think, you can buy as sort of a force multiplier for building anything. I use that microscope, especially as I'm getting older, my eyes are going bad. I use the microscope many times a day, every day. And we've used it, like I said, for everything from professional stuff to, I think the most interesting use of it has been, we took it out to the garage. I have a small desktop mill. We mounted it to the mill so that we could then put a regular screw chuck in the mill and polish the axles for my son's Pinewood Derby cars. So we do some scouting, and the kids build Pinewood Derby cars every year. One of the processes of that is you get these crude nails that are going to be your car axles, and they need to be polished in order filed and then sanded to polish them. So with the microscope, you can really see what's going on in that polishing process. Whereas otherwise with just, your eyes, you're really just kind of guessing with different grits of sandpaper and stuff. And so that was a really fun process because we learned all kinds of things about how to polish those axles that we just never would have learned without the visibility to be able to see what was going on with the microscope. So to me, there's some other fun toys over there, but the microscope's really the one that I think makes the most difference on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I see you have a signal generator. Is that what that is on the top?
Yeah, that's an older HP function generator. I've also got kind of out of view over here the more interesting stuff. A 4-channel Regal digital oscilloscope, signal generators, function generators. I have a bench multimeter that I really like when I'm doing bench work as opposed to portable work with a handheld multimeter. Got some professional soldering equipment, so I have a dual one Metcal station over there, which is just great for doing rework. And then I've got a hot air tool, and then I've also got a full ventilation system. So being that I work on this stuff professionally, so I do a lot of soldering. I don't want those fumes in the house. So I've got a professional quality air filtration system that I can use to make sure that the solder smoke gets filtered really well.
Yeah, these are different times. I probably spent 20 years probably sucking up the smoke from the solder. And it was a good smell, as I recall. Actually, I think I still probably have the same roll of solder I've been burning for the last 50 years.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems like it lasts forever, right?
It really does. I think just a few years ago, I finally finished off the old roll that I had bought, in high school, Radio Shack Rosencore solder.
I think I have the Kester. It certainly lasts forever, especially if you have a few different sizes. Then you use the rotating through them. I just returned from your area where me and my brother spent almost 3 weeks taking apart my father's estate, getting rid of his possessions. I'm looking at your workshop on our Google Meet. It's much similar to mine, and I'm wondering how our heirs will contend with all our stuff. Have you had these thoughts?
That's a big piece. We actually had a club member who gave a presentation on estate planning for hams, and it was very ironic because he gave the presentation and then suddenly passed away a few months later. But it was a great reminder to everybody in our club, at least. We had gone through a process as a club, I think as a lot of clubs do today, have a lot of older members, folks pass away, the family calls the club and says, what do I do with all this stuff? What do I do? I have no idea. And I think for hams, it's a really good lesson to remember that, we should be planning for our own ultimate ends. And we should be planning for our departure and making sure that our families understand, what's important and what's not and how to get rid of stuff. I think it's a really important piece of life in general and of a hobby. My mess here looks a little different than it might if I had a little more space, because I'm constantly reconfiguring things to do professional work in ways that, I might not do as a hobby. So I've got like this green thing back here. That's a BGA reballing machine that, I use a few times a year, but when I need it, I really need it. Right.
Yeah. I was looking at that.
Yeah, in an ideal world, I'd have it in a permanent place on the desk somewhere, but I just don't have the space, unfortunately.
And what is a BGA reballing machine?
It'll let you, I say reballing machine, rework machine. It'll let you take most of the microchips these days in high density devices like cell phones and such, they have the pads are underneath the chip. Instead of being around the sides of the chip, they're balls underneath the chip. And so you can't get to them with a soldering iron. So what that does is it heats up that whole, you put it down over the chip and it heats the whole area up like a little oven until the reflow happens. You can pull the chip off, and then you can reball it with a specific process. So you put new solder balls on the bottom of it, and then that machine will also let you resolder a new chip down in the same place. So when you're working on a piece of hardware that has that kind of chips on it, it's an invaluable piece of machinery. Otherwise, you're going down to the local electronics contract manufacturer and either borrowing time or usually buying time on their machines,
or having them do the rework for you.
Yeah, or just having them do the rework for you. And in my line of business, speed is really everything. So having to plan for a few days downtime in a project while you wait for them to spool up and
maybe sometimes you have to wait a week or two to get in line to use those machines. So when I need it, I need it. And, when I don't, it just takes up space.
Do you like working from home?
I worked in an office for quite a long time. Towards when COVID hit, I started working from home. And there's pros and cons. I really do. There's times when I really miss the water cooler conversation. And I worked in bigger companies, all the way up through a few years ago. And then I've been, on my own consulting, and I do miss the cross-pollination. So I work real hard to stay in touch with friends and other engineers. And I usually try to have a call or 2 or 3 calls a week with friends that are doing other things just to talk and cross-pollinate and bounce ideas off of people. And I have a community here in Seattle called Hardware Happy Hour, which is a maker group that gets together once a month and shares projects, that we're, whether usually personal projects, but sometimes professional projects too. It's fun to have that group to bounce ideas off of.
It appears to me that you had an opportunity to go on a DXpedition. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Back in 2022, I ultimately sold my business and took some time off for a little while. And one of the things I did while I was taking time off was a friend of mine invited me to go on a DXpedition. So Rob in 7QT, another active member of the Western Washington Club, our club president, he invited me to go on a DXpedition. And so him and myself and a few other friends of ours from the club planned an expedition to Palau, to Tango 88. So we went to Tango 88 Whiskey Alpha and operated the DXpedition there for 2 weeks, which, there's that story is on the internet already, that we've done a few different presentations, but it was quite an interesting trip. It did not go to plan. It required a lot of improvisation on the spot, but it ultimately ended up being very fun and memorable. We got hit with a typhoon about halfway through and took out some of our gear and had to rebuild. And so it was quite a fun trip. And I hope to do another expedition sometime in the future.
What was the greatest takeaway for you in that whole experience?
Being with someone who had done a lot of them, Rob in 7QT, was a big piece of it. He knew a lot of how to run the process. So he knew a lot of what needed to be done. And that was invaluable. Having his experience and expertise at our disposal. But one of the things he tried to do was to let everyone participate in the process a whole lot. And so, he sort of would nudge us in a direction, but as a team, we worked to figure out sites and equipment and that sort of stuff together. And really through that process learned, how DXpeditions work. And I think that's one of Rob's goals. He's trying to bring newer folks into expeditioning because he does see it as a piece of the hobby that is kind of limited access to a lot of folks. So, he's done a good job. He did that again with H40. And so I think, having someone that's knowledgeable and experienced is a real big piece of the puzzle. And then I think the second thing is that you really kind of need to be prepared for anything, which is really difficult when you're time, weight, budget constrained, things that I learned a lot about as a, drone engineer. You've got to really figure out, okay, we can take these antennas, but if we do, that's all we've got, or we can take, maybe another set of antennas and that's actually reconfigurable. It's a big roll of wire effectively. And we can change on the site how we set things up and what we do. And I think taking enough equipment that you're flexible in how you set up your stations is a big piece of the puzzle that's really helpful, while at the same time respecting that you're quite limited in the amount of gear you can take. We actually shipped all our stuff ocean freight, which was one of the big cost pieces of the whole process. But nonetheless, having a setup that was flexible really let us adapt to the fact that we ultimately ended up operating in a completely different location than we expected to, and a completely different style. We had planned to be in a community center, 220 mains, air conditioning. We ended up in a picnic shelter on top of a mountain, almost fully exposed to the elements, completely field day style. But we had taken enough gear and we were able to work with the locals to acquire what we needed to ultimately make it work.
You're a young parent, although it sounds to me like your kids are now a little bit older than the pictures that you posted in your QRZ page. How do the kids take to amateur radio, and do you try to integrate amateur radio activity maybe into family activity?
Yeah, I do. I've always tried to, let my kids do as much or as little as they want as far as that kind of stuff they're interested in. Both my kids are pretty interested in technical subjects in slightly different ways. And so, my older son is 12 now, and he's not terribly interested in radio. He's interested in coding. He's interested in coding video games. Plays some video games like all kids these days do. And just enjoys building all kinds of different things. And so we've got, I guess, to the other side, we've got 3D printers over here, and so we try to make lots of different stuff. I think for me and my kids specifically, they see me doing radio. Given that here at the house, the station's really modest. With these days I have a IC 7300 and still have the same in-fed half-wave antenna up. Put up a delta loop antenna for 15 meters to work some more DX and really push my DXCC up from the house here. But I've also taken them over to some of the contest stations I operate from. So KZ1W, Grant has a really great station over in Redmond that I go and operate quite a few contests from. So I've taken them over there and let them sit, in a real station and hear what it's like and talk to folks with that level of equipment at their disposal. And so my younger son, who's 9 now, he's interested. He was actually really interested for a few months in getting his ticket, and then some scheduling stuff messed up the date that he was going to take his test, and it kind of deflated his interest. So I'm trying to ramp him back up. But the kids have always been with me and seen me doing satellite. My older son likes to hike with me, so we'll go and do SOTA activations together. He knows to bring a book, so he'll bring a book and I'll sit on the summit and do SOTA, because he's just not that interested in making the contacts. I think for the younger kids, it's fascinating because they've grown up in a world where, they can pick up the phone and be FaceTiming their grandparents 2,000 miles away, like they're sitting in the same room. So it's hard to pique the exact same wonder I think that I had as a high schooler, putting that 10-meter antenna on the air for the first time and working VKs and ZLs, like they were sitting next door. That wonder, I think, is harder to peak in kids these days, just because they have so much access to technology and their world is so much more connected than, ours was even, 25 or 30 years ago. But I think that being said, if kids are interested in making things, if they're interested in electronics or tinkering, I think the ham radio is just an amazing outlet for them ultimately, because there's so many different things that they can latch onto and enjoy that are just widely varied. Whether it's doing satellites, whether it's doing SOTA while you're hiking or DXing or VHF local comms or working through repeaters. I think all of those are options that different people will ultimately get interested in. And I think so. I think my kids, I would suspect that at least one of them, if not both, will ultimately get their ticket. But I'm just kind of letting that process go run its own course, and I don't want to be too pushy about it for them.
Does your wife have a ticket?
She does. So she did. She got her ticket a few years ago, actually, as a gift to me. She had, we met back in college. So she helped me make contest contacts at K5UTD when we were doing multi-signal stuff. The female voice breaks through sometimes when ours can't. So she's been around it this whole time we've been married, and but she never really was that interested in operation. But a few years ago, she said, "Well, you've really gotten into this. What do I should learn more about it." And so she actually got her technician ticket totally as a surprise to me. We were laying in bed one evening, both scrolling our phones or whatever, and I look over and I said, "Is that an antenna pattern?" No, definitely not an antenna pattern. I'm like, no, that was an antenna pattern. What are you doing? And then she had to spill the beans that she was studying for a ham ticket, and she had planned that next week to go and take her test, and she did, and she passed, and so yeah, she's KJ7 CTW now.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Yeah, I think my biggest piece of advice is to find something that really interests you and go with that. There's so many different aspects to our hobby, and anyone you talk to will tend to intentionally or not, push the pieces of the hobby that they're interested in. And that's great. But there's a lot of different pieces of the hobby. So find the one that really interests you, that's going to keep your attention, that you can go deeper on, and focus on that. And that may last a while, and you may find out that's not the thing you want to do and you want to do something else, but that's okay. Our hobby is big and vast. There's lots of different things really to attract lots of different types of people. And the way I ham and the way you ham may be different, and that's great. There's so much diversity in the hobby, and to me, that's one of the most interesting things about it as a hobby. Ham radio is not a hobby. It's a plethora of different hobbies that all kind of focus around the same pieces of technology.
Justin, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. This is really fun, and I enjoyed hearing your ham radio story, and I'm going to put links to the things that Justin talked about in the QSO Today show notes, but also there's some things that we didn't talk about, but that I clipped from other places, so you'll see Justin's website and GitHub page and things like that. So please go to the show notes for more information. Justin, thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast 73.
73, Eric.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Justin. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K5EM in the search box at the top of the page. You can sponsor the transcription of this episode or any of the previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.